If you want to support my channel, please consider becoming a member. As always, subscribe, like, comment, and share, and continue your prayers. Assalamu alaikum, welcome back. So today we have actually a pretty interesting video about who really wrote the Gospels and the claim that we Muslims carry that they're anonymous. How is that supported? So let's begin.
The Gospels, comprising the first 4 books of the Christian New Testament, serve as the primary source of information about the life of Jesus. Their reliability is often attributed to the assumption that they were written by eyewitnesses. But who actually wrote the Gospels? How do we know? Let's find out together. This might seem a strange question when the table of contents of your Bible clearly labels these books: Matthew, a disciple of Jesus; Mark, said to be an assistant to the disciple Peter; Luke, said to be the traveling companion of Paul, a later convert; and John, also a disciple of Jesus. But how do we know that these are the names of the actual authors? Or can we know that?
It's funny that the book of Mark actually was historically written first before Matthew, but it put it, afterwards. Yeah, it's a whole thing about that.
Fortunately, none of the authors explicitly identify themselves. Within the text, these are anonymous books, entirely without attribution. Now, in the first century, it was not unusual for an author's name to be omitted. The Republic, Parallel Lives, True Histories, and On Abstinence from Animal Food were all anonymous works in the same sense from the same era. However, based on external evidence, these are widely accepted as having been written by Plato, Plutarch, Lucian of Samosata, and Porphyry, respectively. Of course, despite speculation, other anonymous works from the time remained unattributed, like Hebrews, the Didache, or the Shepherd of Hermas. But some precedence for anonymous writings doesn't remove the mystery. Indeed, it merely sets the stage. Before delving into the reasons behind attributing these anonymous writings to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, let's first examine when these attributions began to emerge. The earliest surviving document that mentions the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John was written around 185 AD. Irenaeus of Rome, known for his extensive work against the heresies, addressed various groups and beliefs he considered to be deviating from Orthodox Christianity. During this time, numerous Gospels were in circulation and used by different churches. Irenaeus declared that only 4 of these are authoritative. Those he names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All
like how he decided those were authoritative, even though others were being used by other churches as well. But apparently he knows best.
All the later traditions about gospel authorship trace back to this proclamation. But what about the 100 or so years between the writing of the Gospels and Irenaeus? Is it possible the names were commonly known that whole time? It is true that no manuscripts from this anonymous era contain the names of the authors. For example, manuscript P1 is the earliest extant page 1 of the Gospel now known as Matthew. We know we have the top of the page because we see the character alpha indicating the page number, but there is no title, Gospel according to Matthew, like there is in later editions. Our earliest page 1 was distributed anonymously, no title. That said, if there were debates about the authorship of the New Testament book of Hebrews among church fathers around the same time, wouldn't we have records of similar debates concerning the Gospels if they were similarly anonymous? And considering the geographical spread of Christianity and uniform authorship traditions in all regions, isn't that a demonstration that the names would have been attached to the Gospels early on? Well, these are arguments from silence, attempting to draw conclusions based on the absence of evidence rather than the presence of evidence. The earliest manuscript, discovered outside the region of Egypt, dates only to the 4th century, 200 years after the Irenaeus Declaration. Therefore, we simply do not know when the written Gospels began to accompany oral preaching. Similarly, the existence or absence of authorship disputes before Irenaeus cannot be known. If these traditional author defenses are arguments from silence, isn't calling this an anonymous era also an argument from silence? Actually, not at all. During the period of lost manuscripts, we come across numerous influential church fathers who quote from the Gospels, but do not attribute these quotations to any specific authors like Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. In works such as the Didache, 1 Clement, the Epistle of Barnabas, Ignatius of Antioch's letters to the Ephesians, Smyrnians, Magnesians, and Polycarp, Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, as well as in Justin Martyr's writings, direct quotations from one or more of the 4 canonical Gospels are found. All of these texts date to at least 120 AD. However, none of these church fathers attribute their quotes to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. For instance, Justin Martyr, who provides the most quotations, attributes them all to the Memoirs of the Apostles without specific names attached. The Didache refers to teachings from Matthew as from the Gospel of the Lord. This is not an argument from silence, but rather a positive affirmation of anonymity. If the traditional names were already attached to the Gospels before 120 AD, why would these church fathers refrain from using them to cite their quotations, and even go so far as to use alternate names, especially when they do explicitly credit other authors by name within the same documents? Considering that Martyr in particular was contending with heretical challenges, it would have been advantageous for him to utilize the names if the tradition already existed during this time. The most obvious conclusion is that the names didn't exist yet. Now, if the traditional authorship gained acceptance between 120 and 180 AD, why did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John specifically emerge as the attributed names instead of others?
And kind of like a point, memoirs. I think there's a reason why they don't call it the memoirs, because it'll say that it's just their writing. It's a man-made thing. And that sounds more, a memoirs. That's more of what it should be actually called instead of the gospel. They're just memoirs. They're just writings of people.
To avoid confusion for the remainder of this video, let's refer to the Gospels as 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Gospels based on their order in traditional printings. It is widely believed that the 2nd Gospel was written before the 1st Gospel, so it's a bit of a Star Wars episode number situation. History can be confusing sometimes. While Irenaeus' writing in 185 AD provides the earliest known connection between the name Matthew and the book we recognize as the 1st Gospel, there is an earlier reference from a man named Papias, who wrote approximately 50 to 60 years earlier. Papias authored a 5-volume work called Expositions of the Sayings of the Lord, although no copies of this work have survived. However, there are quotations from this work that have been preserved. In particular, Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in or around 300 AD, reported that Papias wrote, and so Matthew composed the sayings in the Hebrew tongue, and each one interpreted them to the best of his ability. It is upon this sentence that the entire tradition of Matthew's authorship rests. Unfortunately, Eusebius does not provide further context, making it difficult to determine the specific composition Papias was referring to. However, there are clues that indicate it cannot be our 1st Gospel. Firstly, Papias described a collection of sayings, akin to a quotation book, while our 1st Gospel is predominantly a narrative. This genre mismatch is significant, similar to mistaking a map for a diary or a recipe book for a novel. Secondly, Papias stated that Matthew's work was written in Hebrew, but our 1st Gospel is an original, high-level Greek composition, not a translation. Linguists overwhelmingly agree on this point, but for those unfamiliar with ancient Greek, it becomes apparent when comparing lengthy passages where our 1st Gospel matches word for word with our 2nd and 3rd Gospels. It would be highly improbable for an English translation of a Spanish language news story to match word for word with a native English report of the same event, or in this case, 2 different English language reports simultaneously. Thirdly, Papias also described the death of Judas in an elaborate, exaggerated, and fanciful manner that does not align with the straightforward account in our 1st Gospel. If Papias indeed had access to our first gospel, he did not consider it authoritative. Whatever collection of Hebrew sayings Papias attributed to Matthew, it certainly does not correspond to the work we now recognize as our first gospel. The Matthew known to Papias has been lost to the passage of time. It is curious that some modern scholars would place trust in Papias, considering that those who quote him did not. In the same passage where Eusebius records Papias' claim about Matthew, he also warns that Papias' work includes strange parables of the Savior and statements of a rather mythical character. According to Eusebius, Papias appears to have been of very limited understanding. Although some assert that Papias had apostolic connections, he himself described his link to Jesus as being, at best, fifth hand, akin to a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend. Even the very source we have for Papias' account did not consider him reliable, yet it is upon his second-hand and contradictory statement that the tradition of Matthew's authorship is constructed.
Wow.
Unfortunately, questionable Papias is also the source for attributing the writing of a gospel to Mark. When Mark was the interpreter of Peter, he wrote down accurately everything he recalled of the Lord's words and deeds. Mark did nothing wrong by writing some of the matters as he remembered them, for he was intent on just one purpose: to leave out nothing that he heard or to include any falsehood among them. However, if Mark's writing had a singular purpose of being comprehensive, as described by Papias, then our second gospel does not appear to be a strong candidate for Mark's composition. It is significantly shorter and more concise than the other gospels. Without any specific quotations provided by Papias to establish a connection, there is no solid evidence linking the document he described to our second gospel. The author of the Gospel of Luke is the only gospel writer who uses first-person language, stating, "I too decided to write," and handed down to us. However, the author never explicitly identifies himself by name, but instead employs pronouns. In the author's second volume, known as the Acts of the Apostles, there are 4 instances where the author switches from using they to we, suggesting personal involvement in some of the Apostle Paul's journeys. However, the author still does not provide his name. It was observed that in Acts, Paul is depicted as bringing the gospel to the Gentiles, and in the letter to the Colossians, 3 Gentiles, Demas, Epaphras, and Luke the physician, are listed as companions of Paul. Since the narratives concerning Demas and Epaphras place them elsewhere, but little is known about Luke's history, the assumption was made that Luke, the physician, could be the author. It is important to note that there is no compelling reason for the author of the third gospel would necessarily be limited to the few individuals named in Paul's letters. The majority of early Christians remain unnamed, so the identification of Luke as the author is a relatively arbitrary guess based on a limited number of options. The traditional attribution of authorship to John for the fourth gospel is based on 2 passages where the author briefly departs from pure third-person narrative. The first passage occurs in chapter 19, during the description of Jesus' crucifixion. The author mentions the presence of 3 Marys and an unspecified disciple Jesus loved near the cross. The author states, "The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe." From this we can deduce that the disciple who witnessed the event gave some form of testimony at some point. However, it is uncertain whether this book itself is the specific testimony referred to. Additionally, the author does not claim to be this disciple. The narrative remains in the third person, stating, "He testifies," not "I testify." The second passage is found in chapter 21, again referring to the unspecified disciple whom Jesus loved. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. It is possible to interpret writing these things down as referring to the author of the fourth gospel itself, if not for the subsequent sentence. The author explicitly distinguishes between himself and the mentioned disciple. We, the author and the readers, know that his the disciples, testimony is true. The identity of the beloved disciple is never disclosed in the text, leading scholars to propose various candidates, including John, the son of Zebedee, Lazarus, Mary Magdalene, James, or even an individual not mentioned in the New Testament. Regardless of who it may have been, the text makes it clear that the beloved disciple is distinct from the author of the fourth gospel. These are the primary reasons cited in support of the traditional authorship, but they are not particularly compelling. Furthermore, there are additional reasons to cast doubt on this attribution.
Wow, so it's amazing. So even, for instance, Matthew and Mark, they're should be Mark and Matthew, but if you see the deliberate how they put it in there, because you will see then how Matthew is actually completely and utterly copied by Mark, and so is Luke. When you see the additions, you will see the additions of it, and yeah, they're all by different people, and they don't even actually match. Even 180 years, the first time the names are mentioned, and then how they came up with it, all of it. You look at, it's just wordplay and using quote writings from people that are not even trustworthy to begin with, and it's just amazing. And again, quoting sources that don't even exist. If they did, who knows? And that's why they come up with the Q source, the M source, the L source, all these things that are nowhere to be found. But then you're supposed to have what? Blind faith and believe it? It's just...
In the 9th chapter of the first gospel, there is an account of Jesus meeting Matthew, who is traditionally considered the author of the book. However, instead of using his own words to describe this significant event in his life, Matthew simply copies the narrative nearly word for word from the author of the second gospel, who certainly was not present. Furthermore, Matthew does not place himself in the story. He uses phrases like, Jesus saw a man named Matthew, Jesus told him, and Matthew got up, rather than Jesus saw me, Jesus told me, or I got up. In fact, none of the Gospels are written in first or second person perspective to indicate personal participation in the events. The authors do not claim to be eyewitnesses, nor provide literary hints suggesting that we should consider them as such, despite the obvious air of legitimacy that this would lend their words. To be fair, writing in the third-person perspective did occur in the first century, as seen in examples like Julius Caesar and Tacitus. However, this was not a prevailing practice and was used for brief stylistic emphasis rather than as an extended narrative convention. The 12 disciples, including Matthew, would have spoken primarily Aramaic, and most likely fell in the 97% of first century Jewish Palestine who lacked the ability to write in any language, let alone compose literary works in the educated Greek found in the first gospel. In fact, around 155 AD, the church father Justin Martyr wrote, "For from Jerusalem there went out into the world men 12 in number, and these illiterate, of no ability in speaking." Argue that any of them later acquired education would contradict the church tradition still upheld in the 2nd century. While Matthew was known as a tax collector, we should not think of him as a modern-day educated accountant. In Palestine, the position was simple and crude, collection and enforcement, without significant paperwork or need of literacy. There are no known first-century Palestinian residents who were born and raised in that region who wrote books in Greek. It is unlikely that Matthew would have been the first to do so.
Exactly.
Apart from the well-known controversy surrounding the likely added later ending of the second gospel, the beginning of the document is equally contentious among textual critics. Many Bible translations and commentators suggest that the grammatically disconnected first sentence, "the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ," was originally the author's title, rather than the first sentence of the work. Confusion likely arose due to later scribes' formatting choices. If this interpretation is correct, it implies that the second gospel was not initially circulating with the title "The Gospel According to Mark" in its earliest years, as traditionalists often claim. In fact, the phrasing "according to Matthew," "according to Mark," "according to Luke" appears to be a later addition to differentiate the narratives when they began to be collected together. It would be unnatural to write the Gospel according to me. Some argue that Mark was an obscure figure in the early church, and therefore his name would not have been chosen later to lend authority to the Gospel. However, due to limited documentation, we have no concrete information regarding who was well known and who was not. It is worth noting that John Mark is mentioned at least 9 times in the New Testament, which is more frequent than the mentions of the disciple Matthew, who is often considered more famous. The author of the third Gospel, known for having advanced Greek writing skills and Hellenistic cultural references, is commonly assumed to be a Gentile, while an individual named Luke is mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. It is only in a passage from Colossians that he's described as a Gentile. However, it should be noted that the authorship of Colossians itself is a subject of dispute among scholars. The single connecting description of Luke as a Gentile becomes subject to doubt, and with it, the assumptions about his authorship. The same problematic passage in Colossians is our only source indicating that Luke was a physician. However, in the 1st century, medical practitioners often required their knowledge through apprenticeships, oral traditions, and practical experience rather than formal education. Learning Greek composition, which took years to master, was not typically associated with medical training during that time. Given the limited lifespan and the demands of acquiring expertise in multiple disparate specialties, the pairing of Greek writing skills and medical training becomes less plausible. Moreover, the portrayal of Paul in the book of Acts, which is written by the same author as the third Gospel, frequently diverges from Paul's self-portrayal in his genuine letters. For example, in Acts, Paul is depicted as immediately going to Jerusalem to meet with the disciples shortly after his vision of Jesus. However, in Galatians, Paul explicitly states that he did not consult with the disciples after his conversion. These discrepancies, which will be explored in more detail in a future video, cast doubt on the idea that Acts, and by extension the third Gospel, was written by a companion of Paul.
I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling. I mean, this is why I left the church. Like, you're not telling me I need to follow his books, and when you do the research, you start seeing all the holes. You really do. You start seeing all the holes, and none of it's cohesive. But then you're just supposed to, believe it. Just believe it and shut up about it.
Just as it is historically implausible for tax collector Matthew to write a book in Greek, it is even less likely for John, a fisherman from Galilee, to accomplish such a feat. The book of Acts affirms that John was an unschooled, ordinary man. According to church traditions, individuals such as Papias and Polycarp were companions of John the son of Zebedee. However, when examining Polycarp's writings, it is notable that he quotes from the first, second, and third Gospels, but never mentions the one later attributed to his supposed mentor, John. Similarly, Eusebius quotes Papias on the authorship of the first and second Gospels, but remains silent about the one later ascribed to John, who was purportedly his companion. While silence cannot be considered as definitive evidence, it does raise curiosity and questions. While the idea of illiterate individuals using secretaries to write their Gospels is not implausible, a systematic study on the usage of secretaries in antiquity found no evidence of secretaries taking dictation in one language and translating it into another, or being given instructions for a lengthy narrative and then composing it themselves. There are no analogous instances supporting such a scenario. It would be a unique and unlikely occurrence. Considering the available evidence, the most reasonable conclusion is that after nearly a century of anonymous circulation and nameless quotation, when competing apocryphal Gospels with authoritative sounding names like Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Peter began to emerge in the 2nd century, the early church felt compelled to attach names to the existing Gospels. This was done to differentiate them from the newly emerging texts and to counter heresies by attaching authority to their favorite texts. With names already associated with other Gospels, the logical choice was to attribute the 4 canonical Gospels to 2 disciples of Jesus and the traveling companions of the influential figures Peter and Paul. While we may never definitively know the true authors, it is highly unlikely that Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John wrote the Gospels attributed to them.
Yeah, I mean, once you do the research, you find out that, yeah, the Gospels really are, in fact, anonymous. There's just nothing else about it. They're anonymous works for people that, even when you're reading it and doing the research, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit in to who they were at the time, the language of the time, or even the tradition on how it was put together. None of it matches. It matches that they were written by Greeks of that time who may or may not have heard about Jesus. And they kind of just made up what they thought was what happened at that time. But as a word of God, no. And surely not a works by the apostles of, the followers of Jesus. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you guys think. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. And as always, assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.